It's counting off.
Oh, it's counting off on yours now, is it?
No, it's counting up, meaning that I can see the live next to the word live is the second hand.
Nothing's happening on YouTube at the moment. Anyway, we'll carry on as if it's working. Now I can see something. Cool. Okay.
Okay, great. So we've come to the end of our study of the riddles of philosophy. What was that? Was it 14 chapters you were there, Angus? 15, something like that.
Yeah, 14, 15. Yeah, so because we doubled up on a couple of shorter chapters, didn't we?
Okay, yeah. So it's been quite an epic. I and Barney joined a little bit later, but it's still been an epic journey. And it's funny because in this last session, many people were saying every chapter is a blinder. And then there's the final chapter, which is like the blinder of blinders. It's astounding. And it is wonderful because, in a sense, all throughout the book, Rudolph has been tracking philosophy. And through his kind of intense ability to enter into the philosophers, to put himself in their position, and yet also obviously being not them, he's kind of able to point out their limitations, point out where they relate to other philosophers that those people themselves might not necessarily have realized. There's the similarities between two different philosophers that were maybe sort of pointing in different directions. So he's been able to follow philosophy, and in the terms that we've been recently talking about, the development of this being that entered the history of the world uniquely in, I don't know, about 500 BC through
the Greeks.
Through the Greeks, yes. So something that happened there in the Mediterranean, the Middle Sea, on the borders of that, in the passage of kind of the preeminent culture, as it were, from the Persian over to the European. And that's not to exclude the like the Chinese that were going through their I think their Taoist moment. The Confucian, I think, was kind of a bit before that, and then it was wonderful to see how our exploration in the group ended with the Indian philosophy, and so the example of how what is happening uniquely in Europe is not sort of unique in the history of the world and in different civilizations, but it's a different. There's a
an involution going on.
Yeah, so there is something new there. Other peoples have touched on this, but there's something quite original in this moment. And so the whole book, he's been tracking this and sort of, in a sense, nudging us in a way by showing us and sort of mentioning where this could all be going, what this development of Sophia and philosophia could be heading towards. And the final chapter is called something like A Bit of an Introduction to Anthroposophy or Anthroposophia. And so in a sense, although we've felt it and we sort of thought about it coming, in a sense, it's an incredible revelation when he just kind of everything becomes cast in a new light. And sort of there's 2 points there that I'd like to highlight. One is that philosophy has been kind of tracking the world, and natural science gets to this point where they say, okay, and for example, to take the example of natural science, when we're perceiving, we don't actually perceive color. It's something that's going on, maybe a chemical reaction in our brain, and then the chemical reactions are actually, atomic movements that we can't even see, we can only think about. And so everything that we perceive is some kind of illusion. And the revelation in this chapter that anthroposophy gives is that it's not an illusion in the sense of that it's unreal. It's that sort of half of it is suppressed. So we're left with something that is incomplete. And that is very original to something like, say, Bhagavad Gita and so forth, where the description is the world is Maya. But here is, it's not kind of all irrelevant. It's just half, it's incomplete. So instantly, you know, modern science finds its ground in relation to like all the older spiritualities, which might say, well, this world is just Maya. But it says, yes, it is an illusion in the sense that it's not all there. And then the other point I'd really like to highlight is that we've been tracking thinking and thought. And it gets to the point where you suddenly realize that thinking and thought is more, it's not a kind of an end in itself, but it's something that the soul has been using to reach this position where it becomes conscious of itself, and then through exercising this facility, it then gains the activity, the consciousness of the activity of itself. So then what's important is not the study of the world that thinking gives us, but the activity, the effort that the study of the world gives us, that then generates this new kind of life and realization in the soul, or of the soul. And so the focus kind of shifts from just thinking and philosophy to the soul and the human, and anthroposophy. And just to kind of like maybe tie that into terms that might be more graspable to some in modern terms, is there was a lot of discussion about the body and the role of the body and the soul in a sense. And it was raised that Deleuze and Guattari, from the sort of the last third and into this century, last third of the last century and into this century, they experienced something that they called a body without organs. And I think that could be a useful, at least a kind of like a useful transitional concept to try and understand. And Rudolf Steiner, in fact, says that it doesn't make sense to talk of the soul, this new sort of realization, as a substantial thing, as a substance, but as a state of consciousness. And I think that's what Deleuze and Guattari were trying to say in a body. So it's something comprehensible. You could call it a body in that sense. You know, it's distinct from other things, but it has no organs. It's a state of consciousness. It's not differentiated like an organic being.
I thought there was like one particularly interesting part in the conversation where David, who used to like struggle with like some of the concepts, suddenly he was able to say, well, yeah, it doesn't matter if I call it soul or not. It's this magic of when you've got hold of a concept, it's like at a fundamental, essential level, you realize it doesn't matter what you call it. And I think it's like he realized that, well, I mean, or perhaps what he didn't realize is that this is how we understood soul, and then he had us like perhaps a completely different, like perhaps more religious, traditional church-like idea of what the soul might be. But when he realized that no, his idea of what it could be, as Steiner says, doesn't really matter what you call it. It's like whether you've got at the essence of its being. That's what counts. And then that begins to that helps you recognize how it might be described. So, like in multiple ways. It looked like you want to say something, Jeff, there.
That brings up a question for me, because in this, I've never really thought about this in these terms before, which is always surprising to me when I read read something I've read before.
Yeah.
It stopped surprising me. But this idea that when we observe something, we retreat from something within ourselves that would give us the thing that we're observing in its full reality, and capture it in our soul as sort of through a sort of antithetical or repelling kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, in relation to David's process, is that what's happening when you perceive also in the soul? Do you know what I'm saying? So if we perceive a tree, in a sense, we observe the tree, and we have a self-conscious experience abstracted away from the actual reality of the tree in order to go through a process that is that then gives us the full reality of the tree to some extent. Is that true also with feelings and with willing and perceptions within the soul, of soul processes? Do you know what I'm saying? So in a way, you have to deny the soul in order to find the soul, and not just deny conventional thought about what soul is. That's clear that David is wrapped up in some conventional definitions, and in fact is somewhat blinded by his resistance to using language in a way that can unveil or reveal things.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it's only language, so it's got to be a metaphor or a lie or an illusion. But in this case, he did seem to break through to whatever process, what it is we were talking about, but only in a certain sense. I'm wondering if if one has to do the same thing with soul processes that one has to do with biological, physiological processes when you're observing them. You're observing a plant, or you're observing an aspect of the soul. Do you do the same retreat move in order to have a self-conscious experience that then gives you the reality of the thing at a higher level, so to speak, or a more conscious level?
If
Am
I've
I making my
understood you,
question clear?
yeah, I'm going to try to clarify and see if I've understood what you're
Thank
saying
you.
correctly. But the description, this is sort of like as a preparation to then try and tackle the feeling, willing element that I think you're asking about. So when what happens when we it's like through our physiological makeup, we are the actual ones that break apart reality. Reality is a whole that's presented to us. So like the concepts are like the creators of like the things that we see. There's some type of background noise there. Is that?
Yeah, so it's a cat trying to get in. It's going to pester me if I let it in.
So the world is always the world also like exists, so like in its complete reality, but it's when we first receive it without having permeated with thinking, we don't realize that we're only getting half of reality. We're getting the perceptual side without the thinking, and that we have to develop that in our own ego consciousness, or that thinking has to sort of like be added to that. So this is I think, if I've understood it correctly, this is a part of the description of what this exceptional state is. When we perceive something, the mere perception of something won't give us the concepts that describe it. They have to be, we have to create them within ourselves. But it's not like we are there actively creating. What we're doing is we are creating an empty space in which those concepts can then sort of like form in us, and then we recognize them in the world outside. So it's like a thinking, the world thinks into us, into our soul spiritual soul spiritual nature, we recognize it, and then we're able to remember it, and then we can recognize it and sort of link it to external perception. And this idea that comes up often in anthroposophy, so you can think in terms of the world thinks in us. This is an exceptional state. The world feels in us. So also we can I'm unsure whether I should use the word intuit, but we can make space for new feelings to arise as the result of meditating on certain content or observing certain content. And we can also make a space in our ego that the world of will or the intuition can also reveal itself in us. Is that what you were driving at with your question, Jeff?
Well, I think we're gaining ground here, because ultimately this process is a bit of a mystery, right? I mean, excuse me. You laid out the meditative side of things and what the potential is on the end of that, and the one thing he keeps saying and did say in this chapter again, keeps saying is strong, but he mentions it a couple of times, is that that it's necessary that we create a sort of artifice.
Mm-hmm.
This points now to the idea of the mental picture in philosophy of freedom, because it's an individualized concept. Well, what's an individualized concept? It's not just a concept that I hold geometrically different than you. I hold characterologically different than you. I hold it unique to me personally. So
Mm-hmm.
this is my self-identity. This is the self-conscious ego, right? So I think just as without bringing in meditation quite yet, just as a psychological process, looking at the soul from a, say, psychological science standpoint, from a spiritual perspective, which is the only way to do so, the spiritual perspective creates its own the spiritual process creates its own self-identifying, transparent to itself, self-identifying form in the soul, or identity in the soul. And he also says this, he also describes this as part of this process in this chapter, which is that whatever higher versions of this evolution of consciousness, it will be beings that create their own forms that are transparent to themselves. So at every level, that's what's occurring. And we're just beginning to do that within the vessel of the soul life. That's just starting for humanity. It never happened before. When the Greeks were there, they were perceiving this process outside them, because it in a sense is the self-same process. So this then touches into what is it that's being. So you mentioned when you were describing that, you mentioned everything except that when we observe something, we suppress something in ourselves in order to go through this process of to enjoy
consciously
creating,
receiving that new content instead of it being something that we unconsciously just accept.
passively given. Yes.
Yeah.
It's
So
no longer passively given, and we're not satisfied with it being passively given. Or probably if we were, we'd have to be in the life processes, meaning our consciousness would have to be in our organs. If there's wisdom inherent to the nature of things, that wisdom is something other than a artifact, a passive artifact generated by our liver, say. That helps.
I'm feeling a little bit lost. I'm not fully sure what you're driving at, Jeffrey. Can I just clarify one thing first? Is when you say when we okay, the last thing you said was about suppressing so that we can then create. What is it that we are creating?
We're creating a self-conscious individualized experience. Not this is what he uses the term again, is experience. We create an individualizing, self-identifying experience that is connected with the observation only as a catalyst for creating that self-identifying experience. And to me, that's the mental picture I do believe that he talks about in Philosophy of Freedom, which is it's the individualized concept, meaning it's the concept that is wrought with me, my own individual karma experience, all of it. It's wrapped up in this evolving identity that in a sense is an artifice, but is an artifice as a process rather than as artifice as a fixed identity.
I think I'm going to separate. Can I just separate out something there? It's like the mental picture from the concept, because my understanding, and I actually happened to read this in. I don't know if you guys have seen this book. Hold on a sec. It's Prokofiev's.
Yeah, I've got that.
Philosophy and the Philosophy of Freedom.
Yeah, I haven't got so far through that yet.
And in the first chapter, he talks about, you're quite right, it's like the mental picture is individualized, but a concept is always universal. It's this idea that, let's say we've seen 1 billion triangles in our life, but that doesn't mean we have the concept of a triangle. This is something that's intuited. This is something that's given us in the exceptional state. All of a sudden, we get the apple falling on our head moment. We go, oh, this is a universal happening here, and that's actually. And what we do is we link that universal to our mental image. It's like inside us. I think I heard a little bit of mixing of those two terms there, Jeff, but I see them as both intimately related, but actually distinct in the knowledge acquisition process.
But isn't this the reason why individuation is the linchpin for getting to the universals? That unless you make a concept your own, then it's a merely reactionary, necessarily dualistic experience. But once you make it your own, you've entered into a universalizing process, and that's what I mean. So yes, the concept is like the constellation; it's out there, fixed in a certain sense, right? It's the thing is what it is, or reality is what it is.
But it could take one of 1 billion forms.
Well, and there are stages of reality. There are realms of reality on the way to that universal fixedness, say, to some extent. I don't like that word, but let's just say it's there. So I'm not all universal and I'm not all personal. I'm hopefully universalizing as a personal experience, and there's the thing that's the unique thing that Rudolf Steiner offers to humanity from a purely philosophical standpoint.
Is it possible to?
So can Jonathan? I just want to add something there. This comes to Schiller and Spieltrieb, and the idea that this is where freedom becomes possible, because we, as you say, Jeff, there are universals. So like it's like deterministic if we just have that aspect of life, but because we have that capacity for the individualization, the individual experience of these universals, that's where we have the freedom to live in a non-deterministic space. Sorry,
Actually,
Jonathan, I just wanted to add that there.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, Angus, that seems to me to be what I understood you, Jeffrey, to be saying, in the sense that, okay, I'll ask a quick question. Is it possible to experience universal, let's say the universal triangle, without experiencing a particular triangle? Is that possible? Or so I'm asking, can you experience a concept without it being a mental picture? Because that would be my understanding, is that the mental picture is where you combine the concept with a particular, and so do you see what I mean?
Isn't this what he calls pure thinking? Thinking without actually having a specific about it. It's thinking in universals. So, and one of the descriptions he gives at some time is like how an angel thinks. It's like, let's stick with the triangle. It's like when we think of a triangle, it's like in our head we see a triangle, but an angel, and therefore a pure thinker, also isn't limited by having to have it represented as a form. It has all its possibilities included in the concept
without being particularized in any sense.
Exactly, without being individualized. Yeah.
Well, this is the archetypal plant, right? Also,
exactly. Yeah.
So this is I don't know what to call it, because I'm not experiencing it at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm asking questions because my sense of the archetypal plant, as Goethe experienced it, was that he could see it in mobility. So it was always a particular form, but it was changing. It was possible it was continually changing to different forms. So in that sense, I think that's what Rudolf Steiner would call an imagination. So it's not just a mental picture, but it's neither a pure universal.
It's a living concept which shows all the possible. I think he uses a phrase in this final chapter, like Goethe with his architect Urpflanzer was able to see all possible plants, because it was like understanding the concept of a triangle. That if you understand it, it's like 3 points joined by 3 lines with internal angles all adding up to 180 degrees, you can, with that simple definition, all possible triangles.
You've instantly obtained
if you go beyond, if you break any of those rules, it's no longer a triangle.
This is what, in Philosophy of Freedom, this is what, when he's talking about a concept, what a concept is, and he says, you don't question the validity of a concept. You just ask how you use it, essentially, right? So how does it fit the circumstances in which you're going to be using it? So if if a concept about something is a universal, then it's going to be unique to the situation. Right. It's going to have to be individualized in that sense, so that it actually fits it's appropriate or relevant to that situation. So,
but it can be.
He uses the example of a tree, and you wouldn't say there's something invalid about the tree. You would just say, the wood of a tree. You would just say, is that wood appropriate to use to build this or build that?
For that tool, yeah.
But it's possible not to have met a tree, the same as it's possible not to have grasped the universal of triangle. So, just to say that, because if you say it's always individualized in some sense, I mean, the sense I'm sort of getting is, if you had the mind of, let's call it God, then you would have a universal, and at that moment you would have every possible triangle, infinite. Do you see what I'm saying? But if you're Goethe or us, you can only I can only sort of think of one triangle at a time. Goethe could sort of follow plants in development, one changing into another. So there's sort of different, there's a gradation there, but I don't know if it's useful, asking the question, can you experience a universal alone? And if it's enough to say that it must always be particularized.
Only as an individual experience. I mean, how else are you going to do it, right? Because then you're the most personal aspect of you has achieved something universal, yet you haven't lost your individuality, right? You haven't lost your particular I-ness, say.
Yeah.
Maybe that's.
I see. I'm wondering if I see it a little bit differently, or whether we're talking about different things. But I'm going to talk about triangles, and what I'm saying about triangles, I think, is also true about what we've been saying about Goethe's archetypal plant. And it comes back to this idea that it's like, if you've got the universal concept, which is not something that you've created, it's something that the spirit world has given
That's what Jeff
you.
meant by fixed. It's already there, isn't it? Like Plato's archetypes.
So what happens is, so one of the exercises that Steiner gives for trainings like this inner mobility of thinking is basically you use like continually drawing triangles in your head, and I've seen, there's an Italian guy, I've mentioned him before on Matt's channel, a guy called Tiziano Bellucci, and he describes how for 4 years, so like he nearly bored himself stupid. It's like doing this exercise with triangles. But then what Steiner describes happens to him. All of a sudden, they gain an inner mobility. So he's not actively, it's like 3 points there, join them up, color it yellow, and then sort of like doing your skews and your twists and your all the different transformations of a triangle that you could do, the ways you can play with the geometry. Instead of that being an effort that you consciously, right, I'm going to shift that point there so that it now, instead of being an equilateral triangle, I'm going to have a right angle triangle. And you sort of you follow the shift, how that would go like that. You're doing all of this in your head. And that requires sort of like concentration and effort to make it happen, just like it would if you had to draw the process on a piece of paper. But then this moment comes where it does it itself. And you are the observer of that process, of this triangle being that is in continual fluctuation. That's the way I've understood it. And that also squares with my understanding of what Goethe's archetypal plant is. It is all possibilities in one, but that is actually, if I if I move my consciousness into that concept, it starts revealing it's sort of like it's all its potential nature, just like a triangle can.
Yeah. Do we still call that a mental picture, though, or is that something different? Or
a mental picture. I think we would call it a mental film.
Because the things Jeffrey was talking about, we create, and now we've moved to something that is creating itself. And
that's right. And this is the key. This is the key idea that I'm trying to add here. That if I've understood it correctly, this is what happens in this process. If it's being performed with enough soul energy, then actually this artifice that we've created of drawing triangles in our head or studying plants eventually leads to another. It's like the archetype itself embodying itself in us so that we get to experience it directly in its fullness rather than in static forms. So when you said, so like, is it a mental picture? That's like, I was trying to indicate that perhaps we ought to think about it like a mental film, because already in film, we can feel the movement. We can feel the transformation that we can't feel in a static picture. And we also know that's like the etheric, it's like it's an evolution through time, and a static picture is dead. There's you can't feel the life in it.
But we're looking at the difference between a film or a picture that we are creating, and then at a certain point it changes and we become conscious that it has its own life, and it's creating itself.
But we are fully conscious
Yeah.
of how it came into being.
Right. Yeah. So it's
because we through our own effort, we sort of like we went through this process.
Yeah.
Okay, I really like this. I think we're continuing to make progress on this. Let's pull it out of the two-dimensional world, right? And because it's at a certain point you could talk about triangles and you just it's just a flattened experience of reality, whereas what we're talking about by its very nature changes that which just comes into relationship with. So that's why we have an economy, for example. So I was trying to get at the footnotes group is that the economy is a symptom of a spiritual reality that we transform our environment, and that is inevitable as relates to how we do it. Then is where the freedom comes in, and a triangle is not going to evolve over time. A plant is, right? An I am. And human beings evolve over time. So I think we're getting at this plaguing, not plaguing, it's not the right word, but this question that seems to keep coming up, at least for me, which is how do we as individuals, how are we participating in the overall evolution of life? And it seems to be in microcosm in this process to me, like this mental picturing process that results in at first imagination, and then the transformation of the feeling life results in inspiration, and we know the three I's, right? So it seems to me that in this we have the way in which we're participating with the evolution of humanity, the evolution of life on Earth, right? I'm not claiming I understand it at the moment, but I'm just getting an inkling of that.
I think we could like draw this even closer, like what you're saying, Jeff, because what is the riddles of philosophy according to Steiner? It's the history of the being of philosophia. This is a being, this is a living being that is shaping the thinking instead of sort of like moving around the 3 points on a triangle. It is the being that's living in these thinkers, and they are giving individual expression to this cosmic wisdom. And so like some of them do better jobs than others. Some focus on certain aspects of cosmic wisdom and leave others by the wayside. But in the totality, what we're seeing is as it's an individual expression of this living being. And this living being, just like a plant can't grow a flower before it's grown its leaves, before it's grown its stem, before it's grown its root system, also philosophy itself. If we've got this central dynamic going on, we've got ego consciousness, individual consciousness, and then consciousness that's afforded by thinking, and these two fundamental we can only understand through thinking. I'm getting lost in my thoughts as to
you sort of pointing out with thinking there's an objectivity that enters, which then we're sort of already coming out of our individuality in a sense, so it's able to invite another being in. Is that what you were?
I think what I was getting at is what Steiner talks about at the beginning of the final chapter is like, this is the question that's like the philosophers through the ages have been battling with. We've got a developing separation of consciousness from the cosmic consciousness, and then we've got a thinking aspect that's trying to reconnect. We're so like we're in this dynamic where we're for the freedom aspect of development, we have to separate ourselves out. We have to separate ourselves from these living beings. Otherwise, they tell us what to do. They're invading our lives. Do this, do that, and we don't know what we're doing. So we're separating ourselves out from the freedom side, but the knowledge side of us is like saying we want to understand like why the cosmos is like it is. And that's what's like causes us to want to reintegrate. And this is the fundamental tension, the separation from the whole in individual consciousness, but the desire to know the whole, which like draws us back out to the whole, the whole cosmic picture.
To religare, to reconnect. The religious.
Yeah, without losing the center that we've created. If we've created it, of course.
Yeah, I think inevitably we have to, at some point, just sort of, in a sense, by the impact of all the senses, there's a sort of center being created as soon as you, like I believe an animal's responding instantly. And it might have a sort of subconscious memory, but I don't think it's really.
It's acting out of instinct.
Yeah, and yeah, and I don't think it really thinks that it's different from its fellows. When your animal snuggles up to you as though you're another animal. Do you know what I mean? It treats you as one of them, but it doesn't notice there's a separation.
Yeah, it can't even begin to imagine that's like we can do mathematics and we can build houses, and it sees all the fruits of those abilities, but it is incapable of understanding how it came about.
Yeah.
And we stand in the same relation to the cosmos. I mean, we'll make up things like Big Bangs and that type of thing to try to explain it. But if we want to get to the more profound truths, then we have to, as Steiner says, like time and time again, it's spiritual knowledge of the spiritual beings,
but
creators.
This was the interesting turn that it was necessary to make very explicit in this final chapter, that thinking comes up to a point so far, and you can carry on using it to sort of feed your experience, or you can stop using it and let it develop and generate from itself soul consciousness, in which thinking's not lost, it's still available, but it's sort of reserving at least some of itself for something completely different.
Well, it's creating new forms. So it's creating new forms out of old forms. That's the evolutionary process. So we are we start to become participatory in that in the process of creation itself, and that's a deed that we have to choose to do, and then continually choose to do. So we have to carry it out with greater and greater freedom, which means to take hold of the faculties of the soul that are passively experienced, like feelings, and the life processes underlying the willing process, and it's a graduating experience. But it's a deed that we participate in, and I guess that's kind of what you guys are saying, is that it starts to awaken in you as a self-determining entity that's not even you to some extent, but I wonder to what extent
you choose to invite in
I have the feeling that it's more of you. It's more of you than we think it is. That it that,
Yeah. There's a bit in this last chapter where Riddles spoke about the provisional form of the ego. So on this side of that experience, there's me, and then when that soul has come to realization in me, I've come to realize it. Then I'm not that provisional ego form. It's a different. We still call it ego, but it's not as
yeah.
it was.
Well, that's what I was saying about the artifice, that we create an artifice. It's provisional. It's a placeholder, so to speak, or a
Right, I
form
see.
a form creation that we can then fill in with that which actually is, as opposed to that which is provisionally waiting to be filled in. And
Right.
that's it. So I believe that we experience both the filling in and the forming of the a being filled, and also the forming of the of the substance that fills, for lack of a better word.
Can
That's
we
the
to build on that, what you're saying, Jeff? Can we link that to the very suggestive image that he gives of a more correct understanding of the ego would be to consider the body as a mirror, because that also that creates. I think you when I try to understand or create an image that for me describes what I think Stein is describing. It's this idea that there's this spiritual non-body aspect that is looking into me, and the outside world is feeding into this, and the soul organization itself is creating an image of what is seen in the outside world, if we just stick to light. And it's that activity that the ego, the higher ego, picks up on. So this mirror that's going on here indicates that something is being reflected and something is doing the looking. I'm looking at it like that. And if that's the correct, or if that's an adequate understanding of what Steiner is describing here, then we come to a tricky question. It's okay, so if we talk about the being of triangles or the archetypal plant, is that something that's reflected in through the ego, or is that something that is reflected onto this body mirror, and then I see it reflected in the body mirror? I don't know if you understand those, the image that I'm trying to.
I'm not sure.
I don't even know whether it's a good enough image to use, whether you should think about it like that. But for example, this question that you come back to, Jeff, again, how is this philosophia being incarnating? Is it reflecting in the mirror indirectly, or does it have to come through our own I being, our own higher I? And something intuitively says to me that's exactly what has to happen, that it has to pass through us. It isn't it doesn't just bounce on this mirror and then I might happen to see it or not. It's I have to channel it through me. And one of the reasons I think a little bit, there's two angles here. I thought Chad was very interesting. It's Chad, isn't it? The guy who talked about the astrology aspect there, because there he's also talking about being the planet beings, triunes and sextants or whatever it was he was talking about. The idea that there are also cosmic forces that come into play, so it's an incarnation like Steiner can happen. And if we go back to the Middle Ages with people like Giordano Bruno and magics like that, they were really into how do we capture the living quality of certain spiritual beings, planets? how do we capture them in a talisman or an amulet so that we can use their powers? Now, I'm not talking about whether we should be making amulets, but whether we actually, that's what our relationship to the cosmos is. We choose which powers to work through us, and that's also an element of this free choice. And it's like the most classic it's like one of the most obvious choices we have to make is whether we want to serve, it's like a Christian, an idea of, it's like Christ, or whether we want to choose it's like an Aramanic or a Luciferic. I mean, this is like grossly simplifying the whole picture, but it is this idea of what do I want to allow to come into, it's like conscious awareness in me, and then that then flows back out into the world. So I said a lot there.
Yeah.
No, you're getting at something there that I mean, you're getting at a lot there. But the thing that really, the idea of connecting the reflective, say, instrument that is the body with the cosmos, and the way in which Chad was describing how and when Steiner came into that incarnation, and what potentials were there because of it, say. And I say potentials because Steiner himself talks about other people who could not fulfill their destiny for whatever reason, and that destiny would have been something you could read on the you, like, that's not just me, right? So presumably the reflection is there not just for you, but for me as well. Like your body is a reflection for me of that which you wish to reflect, that which you wish to cast upon it to reflect to some degree. Yeah, that's what you're saying, right? And
therefore it needs to come through the ego, as opposed to it's like bouncing around in cosmic space.
Yeah, it has to be you said channeled, or it has to be well, that's why attention is so important, right? And he uses the word here in a way that he did not in the rest of the book use the word attention at all. And he uses the word in this chapter to suggest that's a focusing device for that which is in what arises for me here too is this idea of reflection, because if you pulling way back, if you go to like occult science, say, and I know we can talk about these things because we're all similarly versed, but on, say, Saturn, we were just reflective of the spiritual beings in reality that were there, but that reflection itself is part of the evolutionary process by which interiority occurs, right? And so in a sense, this is a not quite a claim, but a guess based on this work, that what we're witnessing is the soul moving from being a reflective device to something that itself has its own interiority and is no longer merely reflective, and now the body is the reflective device, which will eventually gain its own interiority, in the sense of being a spiritual being as opposed to reflecting spiritual realities. Does that land?
Yeah, and I'd like to add another a further description. When I was looking into Philosophia, Anthroposophia being, one of the descriptions that Prokofiev gives, taken from Steiner obviously, is how, and on the old sun, that the spirits of wisdom, when they reflected into the archangels, then the archangels, so they receive that impulse of wisdom, but they don't give it back as purely wisdom. They change it, and it becomes light-filled wisdom, because the archangels are beings of light. And I think it's also that idea that we are creating an essence of what we are, and this, whatever it is we choose to focus on, have our attention on, channel any of these words that's like indicate a receptive state to something. We're not just a pass-through system where sort of like no change happens. I think the point is that that's exactly what should happen. Something enters to us and gives rise to something new. So like this eternal creative process going on and being transformed. So these impulses are being transformed by living in me, by living in you, and by living in every like individual human being on the planet.
Well, I don't want to go too far here, but if the beings of the sun gave this wisdom light, then what are we giving this wisdom?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's love, isn't it? And if this is stunningly beautiful to me right now. I'm at a loss for words, but I want to say what I want to say. Do you know what I mean? If the very fabric of existence for us is what's true, good, and beautiful, or what is moral, or and what is of value. Is it this chapter he uses the term value, or is it the previous one?
Previous one.
Previous one. Yeah. Then wisdom with light-filled wisdom is ours to transform into love.
And what would that be? What would that love be in that context?
Because he talks about that the mission of the old moon was to imbue everything with wisdom, doesn't it? That's why it's like in the natural world we see so many demonstrations of wisdom, and one of his classic examples is like the efficacy of the building of the thigh bones, like maximum strength, minimum resources, and you can go on the wisdom in nature. And then he goes on to say is that like when we get to the Jupiter state, that in the same way that we recognize wisdom in the natural world today, the beings on Jupiter will recognize everything imbued with love. But how's that experienced? It's one of those pictures that's like it makes beautiful sense, but you're stunned at like where it can. One, the responsibility, but two, how do you even begin to imagine that? I know I can't. I can make the slight logical leap that's like what happened on old moon has to be repeated on Earth, but with a new aspect. But how that in reality works out, I feel like the dog that's trying to understand mathematics.
I think that's a really good, I think it's not an unanswerable question, but I'm wondering if it might be helpful to step back one phase back into the sun, and what is that? If we're asking what is that love, what does it look like manifests in the most complete sense? Because I mean, I know what it means to me. I'm imbued with it now, and when I look at my children and my wife, and but it's more than a personal love. We know that because it's something that wisdom is supposed to be. It's supposed to be engaged with wisdom, right? So, so is it love imbued wisdom, or is it wisdom imbued love, or is love dependent on wisdom to achieve itself? Say, and what is the light that? So, what's the matter with light in the previous? The archangels imbued wisdom with light. Is that right? Is that the way you
Wisdom incarnated in, or was reflected in, the archangels, but rather than just sort of like letting it pass through unadulterated, it's reflected back in light, back to this cosmic being. Of wisdom.
It was wisdom with some well, whatever an archangel is, with wisdom plus archangel.
Yeah,
and so
but then
so love, so this is wisdom with human being.
Yeah,
I think that the attention is going to come in there, isn't it? That word you mentioned that came in this chapter. I'm thinking of the attention you pay to something, that an activity, say, that you really love, or a person that you really love.
Because in the pursuit of knowledge, that love of the subject is absolutely essential. If you want to, again, you've got to extinguish yourself for a while, so that in the exceptional state, it's like the spiritual worlds can reveal a truth to you. And I've lost myself in that thought. It felt like I was going somewhere.
There's something really...
This extinguishing of the self, of losing ego temporarily, so that we can be inspired, intuited. Something can be intuited into us, is an essential part of that process. But then we do transform it somehow. We do work with it. We let it work through us. It's perhaps a more adequate way of describing it.
It seems very interesting that we began speaking about how something is suppressed in our now ordinary consciousness, that has lost something but enabled something more to grow. And now we're talking about suppressing ourselves, that something else can be.
But it's more, if I understood it correctly, if you agree, you agree with me, guys, here. But it's the temporary, that this is something we do. We lose ourselves to find ourselves, and this is sort of like beginning to sound what like you were talking about at the beginning, Jeff. Somehow I'm making a mental leap. I don't know whether it's valid. What was it you were saying at the beginning of this conversation? Can you remember?
Was this Jeffrey's first question?
Yeah, it was. So
maybe you could reiterate it. I didn't fully understand.
Losing ourselves to find ourselves, but you didn't say it in those terms. You said it in a different way.
Was it the process, the antithetical process, where we?
Yeah, that's right.
Where we vacate that which would give us full reality, in order to create a provisional reality that then becomes the vessel for that full reality to come through. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, even when you're repeating that, I'm seeing, I'm feeling a link between. So like antipathetic, so like is this idea of like pushing away, and for a while we push away, it's like our own sense of self, so that it can open up to something higher.
This reminds me of, and I was inspired to write it in the chat in the footnotes group, but it reminds me of what Sophia was talking about in our last talk when she was talking about poetry. And David White, he's in, I think he lives in the Western United States now, but I think he's from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Who is a marine zoologist, and he's a really interesting fellow as a poet. And he referred to poetry as something like, his poetic process is something like overhearing himself say things that he would rather not hear. And people have. I mean, I've had this experience where I was knowing too much before I was ready for it. I think maybe when I was 17 or 18, I was smoking pot, and I would have these experiences of reality that were crushing almost, because my maturity wasn't ready for it, and so I really get the feeling like this is what he's talking about, that you can't handle the truth.
It's there and it wants to come through, and you're giving it ground, but you're like, oh my god.
Yeah, it's an impulse, and it's like, oh, that's not mine yet. I have to somehow make it my own in order to actually deal with reality.
That's a
A
great
friend of
description.
mine was describing yesterday or Thursday. No, it's Friday. Yeah, yesterday we spoke, and she's a songwriter. Her husband she lives in Genoa, and her husband is not massively well known, but he's got his own channel on YouTube, and it's like several thousand subscribers. And she often writes the music for his, and she does the artwork. Some of the artwork is really, really great. But she was describing how sometimes they say, you wrote this, and she doesn't recognize that she's written it. And I think that's symptomatic of what you were just describing there, Jeff. So like if it hasn't come through fully consciously, sometimes we're not even capable of recognizing something that we ourselves, or that has passed through us. It's a little bit like, I was fascinated by channeling. We're going back 25, 30 years now, but I remember buying lots of books on Seth. What's it called? What's her name?
Oh yeah, Abraham.
It was a
The
different
law of
name.
attraction.
There's anyway, Jane
Roberts.
Abraham. Jane Roberts. She might have channeled Abraham as well, but there's a lady called Jane Roberts, and she channeled a being called Seth.
Yeah,
and it was really interesting, just as like a mind expanding idea about like different thoughts. But it is, again, it's like this. She or Edgar Cayce, they're incapable of remembering what passes through them. But somebody like Steiner, this is where he's unique. These beings can inspire him, and he doesn't need a second person there transcribing what he's saying or this type of thing. He is conscious in his being, so that when he comes out of that state, he's then able to faithfully report what's going on. And if I just build on that idea, I think we've had this topic up before, but it's worth repeating. This is why the study of spiritual science is so important, according to Steiner, Prokofiev. It's because what we're doing is we are preparing our minds. If we have the conceptual framework for describing these processes, then when we enter into them, we don't lose consciousness. It is really like a preparation of the mind for when this world decides to reveal itself. We don't just lose it, or it's like it passes through us like unfiltered, and leaves no trace in us, other than like the wonderful experience we perhaps had whilst we're in it, but it's no longer accessible.
There's so many threads to pick up there.
Sorry.
One of the threads is that there's no such thing as science without spiritual science. Science, basically, in his the way he expresses it, the way he reveals it in Riddles of Philosophy, is science is null and void as natural science. It's not providing us with reality.
It's refuted.
In fact, it stays in that provisional self. And then, it could stay there because it just says there's no such thing as a self, right? Except it's where it's encased or entombed.
Yeah.
But there was another thread too. So I want to follow that thread, because there in the riddles of philosophy and in philosophy of freedom are the seeds for a proper science of botany, of human development, of psychology, of sociology, of anthropology, of all the special sciences uh, need to be practiced through spiritual science. Otherwise, we don't have.
Sorry, Jeff, I was wondering if it was the bit on channeling that you wanted to build on, because we could describe ourselves as wanting to consciously choose who we channel and to be able to, or what we channel, and we want to be able to remember that process. That's like the fruits of the engagement with that living being that is not incarnated.
But then it's not, I would argue, it's not channeling anymore, because channeling is we touched on this before. As I understand channeling, I remove myself and something else acts through me.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I might be able to come back afterwards and look and sort of, oh, these are the recordings, and make sense of it.
Like automatic writing and automatic drawing and these type of things. Yeah.
But somehow I think we're touching on a situation where it's channeling, but we're still conscious, and so we're not vacated. We haven't vacated ourselves at any point.
Although there is a suppression of own interests and desires and connection with this world for a while, isn't there?
Yeah. But with love, I'm fully there with my attention, but it's not on me. So that's a bit of a mysterious thing, isn't it? Whereby everything you do and are about is for the other.
Can I throw another spanner in the works?
I wouldn't call that channeling. I wouldn't sort of equate that with channeling, because I'm still there. It's my love, as it were, mine. But there's a. Do you see what I'm saying? Because there's a separation. There's the loved and the lover, but the loved is where the focus is. Whereas with channeling, I think, there's one's gone and another's come in. So you're not loving, as a channeler, you're not loving what you're channeling. It's just happening in you.
This is
unless
related.
You're capable of consciously choosing.
And this is related to the ego being outside our bodies, right? So that's one that comes and goes for me, like internalizing that reality that the ego is that I'm not possessed. It's not in here, that it's here. And so you're channeling your own ego.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
So you're both. That's the thing about that. Knowing that it's a provisional being is helpful, because as part of the creative process, you're channeling that which is creating the provisional being.
Yeah. And when you begin to think like that and to have that as your descriptor of a truer relationship with your inner life and your body, inner obviously doesn't mean in your body, but it means it's like your soul life, then a concept like the double, which Steiner talks about very often, Dostoevsky wrote an incredible book about it, and there's lots of other stuff out there that's really interesting as well, that becomes a lot more, well, of course, the more you become conscious of this being that is not limited to your body, the more you're going to experience what is your body, which you are intimately related with, as the other, as the double.
Well,
and I'm going to try and link this. Sorry, go on.
Well, just here comes love, because what you're talking about is intimacy, and to know someone is to be profoundly intimate with them. So both revealing and revealed. Sorry, you're going to say.
I was going to try and connect this all to the NDE conversation yesterday as well. because NDEs they are, and we actually talked about this on the last Sophia Philosophia video that we did. But since they came up again in the talk yesterday, I think it's worth talking about. It's like why they are both important but limiting. I think they can offer emotional philosophical crutches to people that aren't capable of experiencing within themselves. It's like the truth of what it's like we hope we're describing here. That's like we are something way beyond. We are something much more than just our physical being. And in these testimonies, people are reminded, it's like of an essential truth of our nature, that we are not just purely physical beings. But they haven't. So I suppose perhaps I see it as like a little bit like spiritual food. People who haven't managed to convince themselves yet of their place in the world, and this type of content where people talk about experiences outside the body, and there's lots of scientific evidence to support the idea that they're not just making this up, that these were real experiences. I think this acts as a comfort. And it certainly did to me when I looked into this in details like 10 plus years ago. It's like it's hugely comforting and mind expanding. It's like when you listen to these people describing their own experiences, but predominantly centered around this idea that death isn't the end, that there is something that is essential to us that survives death, that we are not our physical bodies. I think that's something that a lot of people like and want to hear. But if they aren't capable of squaring that, it's like in the conceptual life, having a conceptual life, having a spiritual science that's able to make that square with everything else natural science is telling us, and it's like lots of other things going on in the world, then I think they live as like instead of two pictures of the world that sort of like come together, so like to strengthen the individual sense of so like my relationship to the spiritual world and the physical world. I think they still experience them as sort of like two very separate worlds. I don't know what you thought. What you thought about what we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, I would draw a link to like classical channeling, in the sense that you're not in charge of the business, and it just comes back to that classic thing where if you don't master an idea, it's going to master you. Do you know what I mean? It's always going to be there, worrying, what do I do with this? Shall I follow it? Is that a good idea? Till you can make it your own, it's going to. So, in the sense of the channeling, they can, as you said, broaden your mind and say, okay, this is not the be all and end all. There is something sort of greater out there. And similarly, I'd link it again to the experiences with psychedelics. It can, and it certainly did for me. As a youth, I was starved of something that I knew was missing in the world, and that was the only thing that my culture offered me. That seemed to suggest, apart from reggae music.
What type of music did you say?
Reggae music, because
reggae.
The spiritual message, there was a sincere spiritual message I found in that music. But the psychedelics said there is more. It suggested there was more, but but as you said, it was always apart from me. I could never make it my own, and how could I? Because I had to ingest something. I had to invite something else to me that wasn't me, and so it's always going to be a master of me as in that sense. You know, it's and that's ultimately not what I want. You know, I can't love or be loved by something that is my master. Do you know what I mean? The master in the sense that it obliterates me.
Yeah. In light of our conversation so far, you could almost guess what self it is that crosses that threshold without the continuity of free will.
Go and spell it out for us, Jeff.
Well, it seems like it would be that provisional self, the artifice of self having this experience, and so it's going to be an experience that's fragmented through a prism of former identities, say, that you've created in order for there to be a provisional self to set aside and overcome, and so there's not an original experience in it, say, or and when I say original, I mean that in every possible meaning of that term, original.
Right,
It's not
right.
a self-originating. It's self an experience that is reflective rather than the actual experience that one would have. So itself, the environment, in a sense, that you're traveling around in with your provisional self is probably a manufactured, to some degree, a simulation of a real spiritual experience one would have in intimacy with beings that are self-determining and real, and in a sense, so the provisional self is having the experience. At the very least, the provisional self is having experience, not the self that forms that provisional self. And the other thing about it is that it's something that is an experience that is mind expanding, but that is in front of me rather than that which is my heritage, out of which I came. And we have this death wish in our culture, which is associated with this, I think, which is let's get to the afterlife already, right? As opposed to let's remember where we came from, out of the world out of which we originated, because that's how you'll find what the true nature of that which is transcendent is.
I think it's a real tragedy that we've got a wire cross somewhere, in that many people say, well, these shamanic cultures, which are the older, the more traditional cultures, they use psychedelics. And so, you know, the Bible came from psychedelics, etc. And I think it's a complete misunderstanding, and that the sense I get is that we were spiritual beings, and, you know, we had a spiritual consciousness, we became embodied, and we sort of held that within bodies, and we became more and more embodied. And as that happened, and we were forgetting our spiritual consciousness, we found that we missed it, you know, and we regretted the loss. And in that, we found some substances that helped sort of at least sort of bring some memory, something back to that. And so all these psychedelics are after the original spirituality, that their attempts to get back to it, but they in fact are the proof that it's been lost, and that they are only a substitute for it. And yet today there is like a sort of quite widespread consciousness that they are the origination of spiritual experience, and so they are the a way that science can investigate it, and you know, attempt to come to terms with it, and so forth. And the individual,
but they have to. These are people living in a materialist conception of the world. They don't. Spirits for them are. They don't treat them as real in the same way that I think that we try to. Therefore, they have to like use this as the reason as of why it came about. They don't have the cosmology or cosmogony that Steiner provides, where it's like we have a completely different framework for understanding how this might have come about. whereas they have to. They're a little bit like Eucken and Dilthey that Steiner describes. It's like they've got really rich imaginations, but they are firmly rooted into like the perceptual. They can only imagine things that they have already seen. I'm thinking about Graham Hancock, who's at least one of the most vocal proponents that I know of this theory. And I think he's done a lot of interesting stuff, but at the same time reveals that he is still firmly entrenched in a materialist worldview, even though he had like these incredibly interesting experiences with ayahuasca. He describes them himself, but he somehow can't go. I don't want to say too much, but I see him as representative of exactly what you're describing there, Jonathan. Blame it all on the mushrooms type of thing, or on the ayahuasca.
Yeah, it's a typical sort of scientific reductionist stance. You know, this must have been caused by that.
Yeah, this equals that equals that equals that.
Yeah, which just demonstrates that. And you know, I haven't, but it demonstrates that one hasn't entered a body-free state whereby that is a reality, a spiritual reality with, say, a capital R, and that one is still in this kind of state where you can say, well, the physical world is where it's at, and everything else is kind of just some epiphenomenal thing on it. So a psychedelic experience is as valid as any, Teresa of Avila's visions or something.
It reminds me of Steiner's critique of the mystics. Do you know he gives them their due? And
it's good. It's funny that I gave that example because I thought maybe it's not quite right because Teresa of Avila could be one of these mystics. Carry on.
Well, he refers to the mystics as having essentially having their organs are dreaming, and they're explaining the dream of their physical organs, which isn't nothing, right? But it's also a sleep. It's something that's happening in a subconscious way and has no way to be a conscious experience, which is why we need the soul to mediate between the physiological processes and the perception of what the body can give as wisdom, perhaps. Yeah.
And important in both of those, so like the sincerity, I don't doubt in the slightest that Graham Hancock is extremely sincere, and has created a lot of really interesting material. And the mystics, I don't in the slightest doubt that they were sincere in their desires, but there's a capture going on there. It's like being captured in a paradigm. And this is what we're trying to break out of.
Right. And this is where it gets really important, I think, to speak clearly about these things, and not overly critically, but soberly. That we are in scientifically speaking, we are in a process of the evolution of consciousness, and those were appropriate experiences for their time, and they're not appropriate for this time because they're not revealing the full reality. And only the full reality will do, right?
Yes. Now. Yes. It's available now. Sorry.
So what is appropriate to the consciousness of our time, where the evolution of a soul has evolved to the degree that thinking, feeling, and willing can be a vessel for reality itself to awaken in us or become a fully conscious experience.
Yes,
so and the experience of creating the provisional soul that will be the vessel for that.
Well, the world is providing us with lots of antipathetic stimulus, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, and that's probably part of the process, isn't it? You know, it's like
consciously crossing over the threshold or not. As the case may
do
be.
this and you'll find it unsatisfying because it's not what you're really looking for.
Yeah. I'm gonna spin off as like this is still in this like the channeling like direction, but my mind went off on a little walk at some stage, and I was thinking, what would happen if I just let the concept of we were talking about channeling, and I was thinking about possession in the Middle Ages, how everybody knew what it was, so it's a generalized concept, or at least that's the impression we're given. And I was thinking, okay, what would it be like to be possessed by the archetype of a triangle? What would happen to us then? And I was thinking, so the type of creativity. So this is where you begin to feel the creativity of these forces. All of a sudden, you're chucked into, gosh, wouldn't the world look funny if some people were channeling like this archetype of what would the world look like if everybody tried to channel it, or a certain group of people did. But then another thought was given to me. I didn't produce this, but somewhere then we have the manifestation of the stigmata, and this is also people channeling. That's where an idea becomes so real in these people that they physically manifest what it is they are trying to let live in them.
I think that's but I think it was more not. Yes, of course the idea is there, but it was the sensation, the emotion, the feeling reached right down to the sensation, and then they actually manifested. I think the triangle possessed could be something like a bit autistic. Can you imagine just continually walking you could only walk in triangles, and if you ever saw a blank space, you would draw triangles out.
Well, this is actually a pretty serious brings up a pretty serious question as relates to the way in which those say experiencing those archetypes are formative. Like what
do we have a free
saying,
relationship to them?
We would actually see reality through triangleness, and because of that we would act out, and probably our bodily form would be somehow become triangular in whatever triangular is in its essence. Right. So what is the so right down into the physiology.
But the trouble is
it's fun because it creates a sort of a provisional experience of that which actually is already happening. So you mentioned the word possession, and I look around me. People are possessed.
And you can
it's not a unusual thing like it might have been in medieval times for somebody to be possessed. Almost everybody is possessed. So a friend of mine once said, "Who sponsors your ideas?" Do you know what I mean? It's like, is that Nike? Is that
Yeah.
In a world full of propaganda, the archetypal forms are brands, right? And I feel that, like I've had that experience while building a house. I was by myself, and it was an extreme experience. And I lived in the house, and it was outside all the time, and I would have these like flashes of branding, like the Nike swoosh, come up as if they were meaningful, just like imagistically, and a feeling about it too is really bizarre. It's like I was purging the something, or maybe I'm finding the actual meaning in the archetype of what a brand is. I don't know, but
I think you can tell one is possessed in the sense that we're all possessed, and we should all be possessed, but of ourselves. And if you are possessed of the archetype of the triangle, that doesn't figure into the human body. That doesn't figure into this history and everything, that this direction. So it's going to distort, and something's not quite right. So, possession is normal. Normally I'm possessed with myself, and that's fine because it fits.
Well, this is what's so killer about Riddles of Philosophy, that he does the Erpflanze. Is that how you say it, Angus?
Urpflanze, yeah.
Urpflanze. He does that move on the human psyche, right? And so we have the archetype of the archetype human, but it's not an archetype that is fixed. It's an archetype that's evolving, and the evolution itself is part of that which is archetypal, right?
How does an archetype evolve? I'll put that question on the shelf for the moment. But anyway,
well, it doesn't. So if we abstract a little bit to say Michael, does Michael evolve? Anthroposophia, does she evolve?
Definitely.
And are we in concert in reciprocity with that evolution? And are we offering something unique as human beings that the higher beings can't, so-called higher beings can't experience?
exactly.
And I think higher beings is the right word as I unpack the etymology of the word. Higher means really whole. It's more related to whole,
Right,
not
right.
and it's a hierarchy, so it's a whole archetype. So every being within it is an archetype, and we're not yet archetypes completely. And as physical beings, we're having this evolutionary experience that no other beings can have. So we're both separate and becoming part of the hierarchy.
That's why it's so confusing.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's why we need a real psychology, actually, right? Because people need to know these things so that they can heal. Right?
Yeah, and conversations like this, where you can talk and you can make mistakes in your thinking, and but when you're with friends who have a similar desire to move forward and to grow, that they become meaningful conversations where you correct each other, but not in a judgmental way, but it's how did you mean that? Because it is actually often, sometimes we need to let something stupid, antipathetic, come out of our mouths to recognize, no, I don't believe that, but it was obviously living unconsciously inside me before it actually came out. And if you can do that in conversation with people who have similar goals, then I think it can become a therapeutic process as well.
Yeah.
Who wants to give the last thought? We'll be going an hour and a half. Who would like to round off?
Well, it's good medicine.
Good medicine. Yeah. I think that's a good place right there. This is we all came in damaged to some extent, and the process of healing is a social process.
Yeah. Cool. I'll press stop there.
Right.